Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our webinar. I'm your moderator this afternoon, Vanessa with Location Tech. I'm going to introduce our speakers today, and we want to welcome you. And I think I need to click a couple buttons. Okay, here we go. Our webinar is sponsored by Location Tech and Hirschfeld Kremer. I probably didn't say that right, Keith. I apologize. But before we get going, we want to make certain that we mention Chatham House rules apply today. You have expert speakers at your service today, but all content and commentary is off the record. So with that, I do want to introduce our speakers. We're very excited to be back with Keith Grossman. Keith, you want to say hello?
Hello, and it's Hirschfeld Kramer, but that was close enough.
Okay. Pardon. And our very own CEO, Jeff Engel from Location Tech.
Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. So it's good to be here, and just real quick, appreciate everyone who's sending questions ahead of time. So it's an unexpected gift to make sure that I'm kind of hearing that we're hearing what's important to you. So we'll bring those up during the conversation. So, but thank you for the emails ahead of time.
Yeah, awesome. And for all of you with us today, feel free to use the questions little chat, or not the chat, but the questions window, and submit your questions. We'll take time for those mostly at the end of the presentation. We are recording. We'll share this out to you after we close it out this afternoon. But let's get into it. Panic buttons are in, Measure A is out. We're navigating compliance with Anaheim's Hotel Worker Protection Ordinance and looking ahead at labor law in 2024. So Keith, why don't you kick us off how we got here?
Great, thank you, Vanessa. The ballot initiative that we're going to talk about that thankfully was voted down by Anaheim voters is part of Local 11, Unite Here Local 11's ongoing strategy of flexing its local political muscle to its advantage, specifically to utilize local legislation to put pressure on hotels to agree to what's called car check neutrality, effectively to allow the hotel to unionize, and then also to create, change the power dynamic for unionized hotels where these ordinances have provisions in them that allow unions to waive certain portions of the most onerous parts of the ordinance in exchange for obvious concessions that the union would want to get that it wouldn't otherwise be able to get, but for the pressure created by these ordinances and the need that unionized hotels have for waivers. Moving to Anaheim now, thankfully, the most onerous parts of what would have become the Anaheim Hotel Worker Ordinance, and specifically the limits on square footage that room attendants could clean in a day, that portion was voted down by the Anaheim voters. But I've heard that there's some confusion with that victory as to what's left. And what's left is still a significant piece of compliance for hotels and, frankly, exposure for non-compliance. What most of what we'll talk about today is exactly what's left. What's left of the ordinance covering hotel workers that hotels need to be concerned about. Next slide. So The ordinance, which was not part of the ballot initiative, it was adopted by the Anaheim City Council. What's left? Who's covered? There is no threshold as to the size of hotel that's covered. So essentially all hotels, regardless of their size, the number of rooms they have, are covered by the Anaheim Ordinance. The Anaheim Ordinance also contains a provision that extends its coverage to contracted, leased, or subleased space. So your restaurants and spas, we'll talk about that as we go through the presentation today. But that's an important piece not to lose sight of. Even if you as a hotel operator are in compliance, you need to make sure that your contractors and lessees or sublessees are also complying with the ordinance to the extent it applies. As far as who's not covered, licensed bed and breakfasts within a single unit residence, corporate housing, more is included, obviously, than is excluded. Next slide. When does this take effect? We are now at November 2, if I'm not off by a day, which means that you are less than 2 months away from having to comply with the Anaheim Worker Protection Ordinance. It takes effect on January 1, 2024. So that does not leave a ton of time for compliance, especially for the piece that I'll mention and Jeff will go into in detail, which is the panic button piece. You need some lead time in order to make sure that you are up and running by the time the January 1 compliance date rolls around. Next slide, please. So, I mentioned this already. The Measure A ballot measure got defeated. I wanted to at least provide a shout out to CHLA and its partners in its efforts, not insignificant in defeating Measure A, which is a huge victory for the hotel industry and a rare defeat in the political arena for Local 11. Next slide, please. So this slide is an overview of what's in the new Anaheim Ordinance and what you're going to have to comply with by January 1 and thereafter. I'm going to tick through these and we'll talk about each of them in greater detail. The major components are hotels will now have to provide panic buttons or personal safety devices that have specific parameters that we'll talk about in a moment. In particular, they have to be geolocatable, where people who are wearing them can be located, and people who use it to communicate, the person who receives the communication has to be able to find the individual who activated the panic button. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Hotels also must create a system for tracking incidents, and then how they responded to the incident and any remediation we're talking about. Every time a panic button is pushed, you have to have records. If it's a false alarm, you need to track the false alarms. But if something happens, those records need to be retained, and the incidents need to be tracked. Another piece of this legislation that adds on to something that other pieces of legislation don't include, and that's notification to guests. Most of these local ordinances have a requirement of notification on the back of guest room doors. This ordinance does as well and dictates the size and the font size and the minimum messaging. But what's new about this ordinance, it also requires that guests be informed either in writing or electronically, and that they acknowledge receipt of this notification. And the notification is about how this hotel follows the ordinance and protects its employees. I mean, there's specific language in the statute or in the ordinance that needs to be included in this check-in message to guests. The other pieces that are required, when you have a panic button, it needs to be connected somehow to an individual who is charged with tracking and monitoring any panic button alerts. The ordinance says that the person needs to be dedicated, they need to be trained annually, and that it needs to be 24/7. I think an open question, especially for smaller hotels or very limited service hotels that maybe don't have in-room dining, don't have after-hours housekeeping, don't really have any access, employees who access guest rooms or restrooms after a certain hour, query whether 24/7 monitoring is necessary. But I think that's an open question, at least for now. The ordinance also requires that the hotel be familiar and communicate to employees its rights regarding using panic buttons, and then what happens after an employee experiences an incident. Employees also are not to be retaliated against in the event they use a panic button or exercise any of their rights under the ordinance. Training is required of employees and of, as I mentioned, the people who are responsible for monitoring the panic button alerts. And then lastly, there's a requirement that record keeping about training, about the incident reporting be retained for 3 years. Next slide, please. So before I turn it over to Jeff, I want to tick through some points on panic buttons, and then Jeff will go into the specific technical aspects and the advantages that effective panic buttons will provide, not just from a compliance standpoint, but for other knock-on benefit reasons. The panic buttons that the statute requires need to be given to any employee, not just room attendants or public area housekeepers. Anyone, any employee that has access to a guest room or restroom where they're going to be there alone with not another employee present. So it might be your engineering people, might be your in-room dining people, anyone that might go up to a guest room alone needs to be provided with a panic button. As I mentioned earlier, it needs to be geolocatable, needs to identify where the individual is, the floor, the room, etc. It also needs to permit communication with the staff who is responsible for monitoring panic button pushes and responding to those alerts. A key point, I know a lot of hotels in the past have used whistles or alarm bells or noisemakers. The statute specifically says those do not satisfy the obligation. It needs to be a panic button or some other means of communication that's geolocatable, that facilitates communication, tracking, etc. The report of these panic buttons, as I mentioned, need to go to someone that is charged with monitoring 24/7. The person needs to be designated. They also need to be annually trained. The training on what the Anaheim ordinance says, proper functioning and maintenance of the panic buttons, and then what the hotel's response protocols are. As far as who can be the individual charged with monitoring, some of the local ordinances require a security guard. The Anaheim ordinance doesn't specifically require a security guard. You can have a supervisor or manager who's trained or a security guard. But the key part is whoever is assigned, that needs to be their primary responsibility. If you're a limited service hotel, smaller operation, the question then becomes, can that person have other duties? I think that is a question that is fact specific. It's clear that their primary responsibility has to be monitoring and responding to the panic button pushes. So if you are considering assigning additional responsibilities, that's something that I would recommend you check with legal counsel before you finalize what your compliance plan is. And then I'll turn it over to Jeff, who can talk a little bit more about location tech and panic buttons and success stories.
Thanks, Keith. I started jumping in just before the last slide because the key point is every city's a little bit different, which and I've gotten to the point where I'm now referring people to talk to you, Keith, or because these are getting to the point where there are nuances that need to be that I want to make sure someone who it's a full-time job to make sure they understand these, as opposed to me who's listening to these things and do this. Like I'm a technology person, software, IoT, not a lawyer, and so that's why I really appreciate you coming on board and helping make our audience smarter about these things, because they are different. And as Keith was talking about, the ordinance says needs to provide precise geolocation. The problem, and when Keith and I started working on this a year ago, or when we started doing these webinars a year ago with LA, we're talking about, hey, you need to worry about, and I was hearing customers talk about, you need to worry about devices that just give you two-dimensional location. And we're starting to see those. We're not seeing them this time around a year later, but we're still seeing on the lower right blind spots, meaning you don't get full coverage throughout your entire property. And so and there was a couple letters or news reports that came out last mid-year where people were testing panic buttons and it didn't work. And so as companies are rolling these out, you should put a process in place where you go and test them on a regular basis, and the company should certify that it's blind spot free and clarify kind of what works. So, and then one of the things to toot our own horn, feel a little embarrassed to do that, but toot our own horn is when we're doing these side-by-side comparisons, we are up to 50% better. And we're seeing this with heavy hitters in the space that they have blind spots and they're getting on the wrong floor, which is going to potentially be an issue down the road. And it's one of the reasons why we got into the space in the first place. When the team and we looked at this is, can we really do things differently and do it better? So these are one of the things that we take pride in, making sure we get these things the right floor and getting the room in the right direction. So the key to us. So next slide, please. The other thing when we were building out our solution is we see the shift between, do people want a panic button or do they want a two-way radio? And this is Motorola's two-way radio. It's TLK 25. It's new on the market, wasn't out last year. And it's, I can never predict what the customer's going to want. Like and I even have customers that switch midway through. Some will say, yep, I want a panic button. I want to start with this. I want to start with this. And then they'll say, I really like this one. I really want the radio. And so there's this nuance. And so what we're doing early on with people early on is, if you have to rush, go with the panic button. Put it in, put the panic button in, and then you can always add the TLK 25s later on, because the system operates off the same geolocation system, off the same devices, how it collects the data. They function the same way, same software, same platform. Not to say that we don't have some people who are just going pure radio with just the Motorola radio itself, and here's the panic button, the button on itself, versus this button. So we do have a portion going that. So give the flexibility. So when you look at vendors, make sure that they will guarantee it's blind spot free, meaning there's no dead zones, and you're getting something that really functions for you. And so what we're seeing with some of the Marriott properties is they're putting this in for a majority of the housekeepers, and then 3 or 4 key people will have the radio here, the Motorola radio. So it's all operating the same platform. It comes in. So the general manager and the head of facilities or head of engineering, and maybe one other person will be communicating back for the radios. And then the housekeepers, the room attendants will have these, so the radios aren't squawking. It's not disturbing the guests as it's in there. So next slide, please. So the other part, and we see this later on, early on, our customers that we spend a lot of time in the sales process with will go for this platform approach, and they'll usually they'll add something in later on. So if you look at the lower right, leak detection, theft monitoring, so if something's removed from the room. We also do some things with guard route tracking. The faster the sales process and the closer we get in these mandates, such as it's less than 60 days, we say, put a panic button in, and if you want to add this stuff later on, add it later in. Don't try and shove it in now, because you can add these in piecemeals. You can add one leak detection in, or at one property we have all 200 rooms put in with some other devices. You can always add them later on once you put it in the wireless network, or you can just do a pure radio thing on. But think about the platform. So this is really future-proofing what you're doing, and so you can always scale and add on, as opposed to just a pure panic button solution. That's all it does, is we've come to this platform approach. So do you want radios? Do you want panic button? Do you want leak detection? Do you want temperature monitoring? And that's been the whole mindset of what we're doing, is give something that you can grow into, and add as you need, but don't add it if you don't need it and don't want it. Next slide, please. So quick use case, and this is about our scalability, or how we scale. So this is Valley View, one of our early customers, tribal casino. It's a multi-acre property. So you have the casino, big casino floor, you have a hotel, then you have HR up the hill. And so we covered that entire area with a couple of base stations, and they added in as they're doing. So they started out with panic buttons, just this. And then they had a problem where they had a guest where they flooded a room. So then we added leak detection in there. And then early on during the pandemic, they also had one of their number 2 complaint from guests was they'd fill up the Players Club card, and then they would go to the hand sanitizer and it would be empty. So they were like, wait a minute. The complaint to the GM was, I just gave you $500, or I just put $200 on my Players Club card, but you're not keeping me healthy. And so, and since they've removed that feature, But what it did was it allowed us to be able to put it in quickly till they got their processes solved. So 6 months later, we actually removed those from the platform. But because we have this platform that's extensible, you can add stuff in and you can take it away. And that's what we did with the hand sanitizer dispensers. And then since then, we've added, along with the panic button, we've added the Motorola Moto Turbo radios into the platform. So now all the security personnel, because they have a pretty good security force, it is already very safe property. It was already safe before we went in there. But the security force has Moto Turbo radio. So now security uses Moto Turbo radios, and then the guest room attendants are using the panic buttons, and some have the option to use radios when they want to do that. So that's how one customer's using us. They started with something simple and have added as they've needed it. Next slide. So I was going to switch over to Keith, but when Keith is, I want to talk about Boyd Long at Valley View is kind of like, he already had a safe property, but he's always looking how to add another layer. You can go back to the next slide because it's really a transition, Vanessa. But he's always looking to add another layer. And so what I'm starting to hear, and I saw this a while ago, and I realized I was kind of ahead of the curve where the audience is, but I'm starting to get questions. This is one of the questions we have, is talking about duty of care. When it's appropriate, Keith, can you talk about duty of care first? What is it? And how does that apply to what's going on now? Which also ties into, I appreciate, Keith, that you help us keep straight on what's happening in LA versus what's happening in Anaheim versus Irvine, et cetera. So duty of care is the question I want to make sure we talk about.
Yeah, no. It's standard of care, duty of care. I mean, you owe a duty of care to your guests, you owe a duty of care to your employees. And a standard of care is a concept, a negligence concept, where you always want to satisfy the standard of care. If you exceed it, you're arguably not going to be negligent. If you don't meet the standard of care and there's an injury or accident, then you could be found to be negligent. And so in the context of what we're talking about, as local ordinances come into being, not only in California or Southern California, but also obligations imposed under citywide collective bargaining agreements, for example, in New York City, at some point, if you're a company that has hotels in New York, in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, in Anaheim, and your hotels there have panic buttons, how do you explain why you don't have panic buttons at your other locations? And if, God forbid, there's an incident where an employee's carrying around a panic button might have prevented a larger escalation and enabled law enforcement to find, for example, God forbid, an active shooter quicker than it was otherwise, and their injuries or the like, yeah, that creates a standard of care issue. So, to say I'm in El Paso, Texas, and I don't have any legal obligation and I don't have a collective bargaining agreement, query whether there's an industry standard of care issue staring you in the face nonetheless. But I think that answers what you were questioning.
No, it does, and absolutely. And so this is actually one of the reasons. You talked about active shooter, which this is not about active shooter, but that was, and Keith and Vanessa, you and I we've talked about this, and the tech team is all from Qualcomm, so they're very good. Their focus is wireless, not only just cellular, but it's Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, all these wireless frequencies, etc. So And then on the other end is where I came into this world from being a responder, is kind of doing hostage rescue and doing direct action missions. And I hope we never have an active shooter. But one of the things that we've thought about is, and I even explained this to the team, like, well, if you have an active shooter, you can't track the active shooter. You're right. Because the active shooter is not going to walk around with a panic button, just not. But what it does, and I think, and this happens at school shootings, is you walk up, the police force hasn't responded before, or they may not know the layout very well, and you kind of get people to start congregating around, like, how do we go in and start clearing the buildings? And so one of the things that I think is important to look at, and I hear people say, oh, it'll never happen to us. Maybe not. I hope it never does. But one of the things that we've looked at is, since our stuff works in a browser, is a police assault force. You literally hand them a tablet, and then you can light up everyone who's in the building. And by the way, we don't track anyone. We absolutely do not track anyone. But as soon as an alert happens, then we can track people. So we track people who push the buttons. We also, but an assault force can come up and look and say, oh, here's the layout, digital layout, everything. And here's where I know people are. And here's how I need to go get them out. So you can start systematically working through and clearing the building, getting the people, the workers out. So it's a quick way to give employees, like, hey, we're going to come find you and we're going to protect you. And I think we talk about duty of care, and we talk about if enough this is set as a precedence, it's going to hit you. I'm seeing enough things as being a first responder, former first responder, and kind of having to kick in doors. Like, how would I want to have a tool that helps me find people so I'm not going, I have no plan? We help them build a plan to solve these things. So I think that's why it's important, is as the world is kind of changing, unfortunately, duty of care, but also giving the teams that have to go in and find these people. And maybe it's just finding someone who's sick, but going to find them is having a system that actually can give you real information. So it's as we talked about earlier, beyond today solving things. So
yeah, it could be, yeah, it doesn't have to be as dramatic or extreme as an active shooter. It could be a fire that's extremely dramatic, but as you say, it could be somebody, a worker slipped and fell and is hurt. It could be they had a heart attack, or they're in a room where a guest has injured him or herself, or has had a heart attack, and they press the panic button. They're in immediate contact with the responder, and it will hopefully facilitate a quicker response. It's geolocated, and you may save a life.
Yeah, I also feel like we staged that question, that comment, because it wasn't staged for everyone who's listening to this. But so I get asked a lot, like, how many incidents do you have? We don't have a lot. Like, let me restate it. I don't want to say we don't have a lot. We have more triggers or more alerts come in because someone's not feeling well, or they need assistance for a guest, or there are multiple things. Like, we do get a few cases, but the majority is, hey, I need help. And we're doing some other things that are coming out in the future that's really around making sure that people can get help to help them, et cetera. So it's beyond, it's used much more commonly for common occurrences that people may not necessarily be tracking. So I will stop talking at this point, Keith. You can go ahead.
Great. So moving on to other pieces, components of the Anaheim ordinance that is taking effect on January 1. There's a whole section on what employee rights are. So it's, in the event that they trigger a panic button, they can't be retaliated against for doing that. But in addition, if they are witness to or part of an incident involving violence, threats of violence, sexual misbehavior, etc., the statute provides a number of things that a hotel has to provide in response to that employee. One is up to 3 hours right away, paid. Again, it's paid. Time off, go home, go to the doctor, go, this is an upsetting situation. The employee at his or her discretion can take up to 3 hours off paid. The employee should not be discouraged from making a report to law enforcement. Frankly, I think there's a lot of reasons why hotel may want to encourage that. But at the end of the day, whether or not a report is made to law enforcement, if an employee wants to make it, that has to be allowed. The hotel may decide, even if the employee doesn't want to make a report, that you may want to call law enforcement anyway, especially if it's an issue involving, serious sexual misconduct or an assault or potential assault. You may want to call law enforcement. Even if the employee says, well, I don't want to do it, but there are lots of reasons why the hotel would want to. The law also requires that the hotel reasonably accommodate the employee victim. So, if the employee says, well, I really want to keep working, but I don't want to go back in that room. Maybe a manager, if it's not a serious enough incident where the guest is going to get 86th, it may be the manager covers whatever needs to happen in that room, and the employee gets assigned somewhere else, or the employee gets to take time off the next day or two, or clean in a different area, or gets assigned on a team. None of these are necessarily required. Like any other type of reasonable accommodation, the issue is having the dialogue with the employee, figuring out what he or she wants, and if it's reasonable, the law requires that the hotel do it. And again, the last part of the statute is that no retaliation can be taken against the employee for asserting any of these rights or for pushing the panic button. Next slide, please. Another key component of the law is training. We touched on that already briefly. Employees, and you're going to have to be ready to launch on January 1, because within 30 days of January 1, every one of your employees will need to be trained on the use of panic buttons. On the hotel's, I call it SOP, that's your whole program. The training, who's going to be the response people, the use of the panic button, the maintenance of the panic button, the no retaliation, all that, tracking the incidents, all that stuff will have to be part of the training. Employees also need to be trained on what their rights are, and those are the ones we just covered. After the first 30 days, when you've trained all your employees, all new hires will need to be trained within 30 days of their hire. Probably a good idea, makes sense to just include it within your new employee orientation so that it's not an issue. But new employees would need to be trained on this within 30 days. And then the individual or individuals who are assigned and dedicated to monitoring and responding to panic button alerts, there are specific training obligations for those folks as well. And that needs to be done annually. Next slide, please. We talked about the notice to guests. Time of check-in, they need either a writing or an electronic notification that's specified. The language is specified in the ordinance, and the guest has to acknowledge. It may just be if you've got electronic at check-in, yes. If it's written, they'll need to sign off that they've gotten the required message, and then you've got to have the sign on the back of your guest room doors. Next slide, please. This often gets people tripped up, record keeping. Hotels are going to be required to retain records for 3 years of any time a panic button is pushed, and then if there's an actual incident, all the details surrounding the incident. Next slide.
Just to add on that, the
Sure.
system you get should do that. Like you shouldn't have to track it anywhere else. So it should all be in one place. All you have to do is remember your login, and so that your history is kept. And so anyone who's doing a hosted system has all that information for you.
So you'll have the record of the panic button push, but you will also need to retain records of the incident. So for example, if it wasn't a false alarm and there was actually a threat made against a room attendant, the responder responded, you'll need to document what happened. You'll need to complete an incident report, and that paper will need to be saved for 3 years.
Yeah, so a little dangerous to ask since it's being recorded. We have the ability to put it in and then put it and store it in the system. It does it need to be hard copy or digital storage?
No. As long as it's retained in some format for 3 years, that's fine. So, the manager, the responder will need to be trained again on the SOP. So you've got to have an incident report. If you take statements from the guest, from the employee or other employees, if the guest is given a warning, if the guest is 86th, whatever happens, if it was just a misunderstanding, all of that needs to be documented, and then you can, if uploaded in the system, store it electronically. That's fine.
Thanks.
Sure. So in addition to doing the right thing and protecting your employees and potentially your guests as well, there's also the stick aspect of why compliance is important. The ordinance has pretty significant remedial aspects. So it provides a private right of action. So an aggrieved employee can sue the hotel in court, and they would be entitled to the greater of, if either actual damages or at a minimum penalties. The penalties are $100 per person per day. So if you have a bunch of people, one thing I could think of, if you're not providing, example, the guest notification and acknowledgement and check-in, or you don't have the signage on the back of your door, or you don't do the training, that could be multiple employees, $500 a day for as long as those violations continue. Obviously, that adds up pretty quickly. The person who brings the action, or they're entitled to their attorney's fees and costs, and if it's an intentional violation, damages are trebled. The other piece in this law, and I mentioned it earlier, the hotel could be jointly and severally liable for violations by its contractors, lessees, temporary service providers. The ones that jump to mind are the spa, where there might be people alone in a locker room or a restroom. They need panic buttons. They would need training. So the contractor, while the contractor would need to deliver all that and comply, the hotel needs to make sure that in its contracts with these third parties that these obligations are spelled out, because if at the end of the day, if there's non-compliance, the hotel is also on the hook. Next slide. So that's the Anaheim ordinance in a nutshell. When Jeff and I were talking before this, Jeff asked, well, what what other mischief is out there. Local 11 has been passing local legislation, starting with the LAX corridor, I think in 2007. But now there are significant ordinances covering, obviously, panic buttons, but also square footage limits, limits on overtime, and other provisions. There are ordinances now in effect in Los Angeles, Santa Monica, West Hollywood, Glendale, Irvine, Long Beach. In addition, the union has petitioned the city council in Santa Monica to make that ordinance even more predatory and difficult to comply with. The union has also proposed additional similar legislation in Beverly Hills, in Culver City, and then in unincorporated areas of LA County. They've gone to the LA County Board of Supervisors and asked them to promulgate a lot of what we're seeing in the other jurisdictions. So given the ballot initiative, I suspect for now, at least in Anaheim, they're done, but in nearby Irvine, they got everything they wanted, and it wouldn't surprise me that in addition to Beverly Hills, Culver City, and LA County, that Local 11 has other jurisdictions where they're able to pass local ordinances.
Yeah, I maybe I shouldn't give away the strategy for Local 11, but Irvine passed quietly. Not many people knew it. It came on. It came. Maybe it's because they didn't have as many hotels, but it came and went. And it almost feels like they did too much of a land grab in Anaheim, because when they put the convention center, they put the I think the stadiums were included.
Charity of YMCA, right? So that was, it definitely coalesced.
Which then all of a sudden, if you're a resident of Anaheim, you're like, what? This now impacts me a little bit more, and so I'm maybe a little bit less sympathetic to the plight of what Unite 11 is trying to do. So what I think, I started alluding to this earlier. Everyone's getting smarter on this, on how to go to battle, and so I think that the ballot initiative was defeated. That doesn't mean this is done. And that we talked about the duty of care earlier, and I've been seeing this for a while. And I'm not some crystal ball reader. It's just because it's where I focus. But this is not going away. So which you talked about. So I'm curious to watch how this thing happens in Beverly Hills, Culver City, and LA County, how that's going to come through. And a lot of it's really just how the Board of Supervisors is. Like, what are they going to do? Are they just going to push through the panic button to move on to the next thing, which is what Anaheim did? They split the two out, and they allowed the conversation to still happen. And so we're seeing some cities, are they going to do it or not do it? And it's a mixed bag of trick. But as soon as Unite here, or Unite 11 gets in, it ups the game significantly. So
we have a little bit of time. Before I take questions, I just want to give two teasers and some bonus topics, completely off topic from the Anaheim ordinance, but I think it's critical that I at least flag this for people, because these two NLRB developments are, in my view, game changers. The first one I'm going to talk about, it's got the heading here, perpetual campaign mode, for a reason. The CEMEX case, which is an NLRB case that came out not too long ago, really does change the game completely. It used to be that the way to resolve whether a group of employees wants to be unionized or not, absent the employer agreeing to a card check neutrality agreement, is through a secret ballot election conducted by the board. This, and always in response to a petition filed by a union. This changes the game in a significant way in two aspects. One, if the union presents a petition or cards to a general manager, human resources, et cetera, and says, here are cards, we have a majority of support. Used to be the employer could throw it in the trash, not touch it. Nah, we're not interested. Go to the board, get an election. Now, under this decision, if the employer does nothing within 2 weeks, then there's a bargaining obligation, and the board is going to require you to recognize the union and bargain. The only way you can keep from having that obligation is within 2 weeks to actually file with the board an election petition, an RM petition is what it's called. But you have to affirmatively go in and file a petition for an election. And then with the board's quickie election review rules, there's going to be a quick election and not a whole lot of time to campaign to present management's position about why unionization is not in anyone's interest. So again, that's going to require hotels to be ready, managers to understand their obligations, because if things sit on the desk for 2 weeks, you end up with a union. The other piece of this that's a critical game changer is even after you file the petition, it used to be that unless an employer committed egregious unfair labor practices, what are called hallmark violations, things like firing large groups of employees, giving massive wage increases, threatening to shut the hotel, unless those things happened, the remedy would be, okay, you won that election, but we're going to throw it out, you get another election. The remedy now is a bargaining order. So you don't get another election, you end up with an obligation to bargain and you got a union. The difference under this case is you no longer need the hallmark violations. Arguably, any minor violation, including one of the technical handbook violations, could end up in a bargaining order, which means no election and you end up with the union. So in order to counteract this, you really need to be in perpetual campaign mode, training your managers, training your supervisors, conducting labor vulnerability audits, et cetera. So that's one bonus tidbit. The other bonus tidbit, next slide, is.
Can I add
Sure.
a comment? So I want to, for the audience, we've been talking about Anaheim. I want everyone to take a step back. That what Keith is talking about is national. And so I know there's a couple people here that are from the East Coast watching, and a couple people from Chicago, etc. Like this now, outside of panic buttons, this now applies to everyone. And this is where, when I say I'm not the legal expert for Anaheim, so that's the reason why I work with Keith on this, to make sure you get the word out. For the hotels and the brands, this is worth the conversation. I'm not trying to pitch Keith. This is worth the conversation with Keith to make sure you really understand this, because from a risk management standpoint, in the big brands and the things have risk managers. I sat next to one at one of the management companies just last week back in DC. This is one where the risk manager needs to start paying attention so that he or she puts out the training, just like Keith said. But I just want to make sure we highlight, this is national. This is not an Anaheim discussion. National.
Yep.
So
thanks,
okay,
Jeff. And it'll be your typically your labor relations teams that are undoubtedly on top of this development and need to launch the training and make sure folks are fully up to speed. The other gift from the National Labor Relations Board that just came out last week is a new rule on joint employer. It lowers the threshold for, corporate people. I'm not going to get into it on this call, but it, creates issues that do involve a risk assessment of what you're going to put in your brand standards, even for franchise hotels. But for the purposes of this audience, this is a good time to take a look at your contractor agreements. You know, we're talking about night cleaning, valet parking, groundskeeping. Those are ones, if they are structured properly and administered properly, you're not going to end up with a joint employer finding. But since the threshold is lower and significantly, it used to be that you as the hotel had to exercise some control over your night cleaners, your valet parkers, your groundskeepers, et cetera, over what they do, over their terms and conditions of employment. The law has changed such that you don't actually have to exercise that control. If it's in a contract and you have the potential to impact your contractor's employees' terms and conditions of employment, under the rule, you'll be found to be a joint employer. So it is a good time to take a look at your contracts. So that was a little bit of a bonus. With that, I will be happy, and I'm sure Jeff will as well, to entertain any questions with whatever time we have left.
Yeah, we do have some questions. And this is going back to your presentation, Jeff, on the indoor geolocation. I'm going to make this kind of one question. The Location Tech platform, is the network running on Wi-Fi or not? And can you help us understand how the Motorola Radio and a panic button are connected? And actually, this is part 3. Is the hotel required, or how are access points installed in rooms and or on premises anywhere? Did you follow that?
Yes. So I think with this one,
Network.
I'm going to answer it, and I do want to follow up with this person because it's not a loaded question. It's a deeper conversation because I want to make sure I get this right. So this button operates on LoRa, which is 900 megahertz, which gives a long range. So the base stations for this outdoors have range up to 8 miles. So this is the network for all the sensors that we have that are outside the radio. This radio, this one here operates on Wi-Fi. And what this does, we put a beacon in every room. And while this is working on Wi-Fi and this is working on LoRa, the beacon ecosystem is how it tracks. Both these are picking up and reading the beacons. And there's actually a very, very fine art in how we do this because even though they're different frequencies for how they communicate back, the part that we're connected into is this network of devices, and that's kind of where a lot of our secret sauce is. How do you read that? Because there's a lot of people who take this, actually everyone, because we have installed some of our competitors, which why they let us install it, I'm not sure why, but we went and installed our competitor solutions to understand how they work, which was one of the early reasons why we did that, is to make sure could we really do anything. So LoRa 900 megahertz, Wi-Fi, for the location. They all come back in the same platform. So you're looking at one platform thing. So it's the customer or the property doesn't see the difference. And then, which I don't have in front of me, the Moto Turbo Radio operates on a separate frequency, and those have repeaters, but there's other systems out there that work in. So it's really kind of dependent on, because like the Moto Turbo, the latest one is Ion, but they have the 7500 series. Those will operate on repeaters. So when everything goes down, those radios stay up. And so with working with Motorola, we have this layered approach. So you can give your security guards have the Moto Turbo line, which when everything else goes down, it stays up. We have this for the top managers that want to be able to communicate and do the panic buttons. And if you don't want your housekeepers or guest room attendants to have two-way devices, you can give them this, which then gives them the communication or way to communicate. It also vibrates when you give them feedback that the message has gone through. So there's multiple approaches. So I hope I answered the question right, but I will get, if you can make sure I'll reach out with you afterwards, Vanessa, and make sure I get the person's information to follow up with them. So
Yeah.
I usually ask, did I answer your question after that? And I find out I usually get it 80% right. And we added 20%. So
It's all good. This question is probably for Keith, but when it comes to the acknowledgement that the guest has to receive or the notification that your guests have to receive, how is that handled if it's digital check-in? Does it just get handled, as part of other disclosures, or does it have to be handled very separately? Anything, a signed document, or can it be electronic?
It can be an electronic acknowledgement under the terms of the ordinance, but it probably should be a separate page that has the magic language that is required in the ordinance, and then click acknowledged. But obviously, technologically, and I am a bit of a Luddite, so I'm not going to go out over my skis. I don't know how difficult that would be, especially with mobile keyless check-in and all that stuff, how difficult it would be to add an a la carte extra page. Maybe it's not that different, but if you can, that's sufficient. If you can't do that, then it has to be something at check-in. It can be a separate electronic acknowledgement that gets stored in, the folio, whatever you preserve for 3 years, or just a piece of paper where they sign and acknowledge.
So can I put my geek hat on?
Sure.
Hey, to answer your question, Keith, it should be easy, not easy. It depends on the system architecture of how it's structured, meaning the actual of the application, the back end, and the system structure. So if you think about, if you have a messy desk, hard to find that piece of paper, or hard to put that form in. If you set up your system architecture in a very deliberate, like if you think about a file cabinet with lots of drawers, very organized, and the hanging folders are all well marked, then it becomes easy. And so when I explain the system architecture to people, I use the file cabinet versus a messy desk thing. So if someone's done their homework, which don't want to tell my system architect guy, but I will, because he dreams 4-dimensionally in code. He thinks about that very much deliberately. So if you've done that, you can add these things in. It's why we can add all these other devices in. So the question is, it should be easy, and whoever they're using for their management system, their check-in system, it should be a functionality that, just like when you check in for when you go check into the doctor, you sign some forms. You sign some forms, you go on to the next page, you sign it, and then you move on. So it's very distinct. So it really depends. A big portion of that's really how the system architecture set up, but it should be a page. It should be easy. And so it should be something that they should be able to do digitally. But you're right. If they don't, then they need to keep a paper copy of it. Sorry, I put my geek hat on.
It should be easy. Of course it should be. That brings us to the end of our time today. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And again, this has all been recorded, so we'll share it with you. This is information for reaching out to Keith if you would like some more legal advice, and Jeff at Location Tech as well. And last word, Keith and Jeff?
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully everyone found it useful.
I'm just gonna add, this is getting complicated enough with the nuances that if you prepare ahead of time, it's not about panic buttons. This is about kind of the last part of Keith's discussion. If you plan ahead of time for the mismanagement, what are you doing to make sure all your papers in order and guests sign the right things, or the joint employer law, or some of the other stuff that's come out from the National Labor Group, that if you plan ahead, it's not an issue. If you don't plan ahead, you're in trouble. Like you're gonna get dinged, and that's where, again, I'm not trying to pitch. This was not about pitching Keith. But if you're not sure what you need to do, reach out to Keith. Again, so again, not trying to pitch Keith, but I learn a ton. Keith, thank you for doing this, because I learn a ton from every time I talk to you. And I think I'm probably a few steps ahead of the people I talk to at the hotels. And so sometimes they really need to have a conversation with you. So, and the brands are better, but there's some local management companies that could benefit from talking to you to make sure they've just got it right. Spend an hour or two with you to make sure, okay, here's what we're doing. Are we good? Or where the holes are? So you're very valuable resource.
Thank you.
And I concur. And with that, I see a few thank you comments. So thanks to you both. Really great time well spent. And everyone, you'll hear about the next iteration that we spin up with Keith and Jeff. Thank you so much. Take care and goodbye.
Thank you.